The first apple tree came out of the earth with its roots clawing at an empty gray sun. From the porch of at Hadley Farm at Laverne watched three yellow machines grind across land her family had owned for more than 60 years. The north fence was already crushed into broken boards and twisted wire. A stranger held court papers beside the lead machine, while another blade turned toward the row her husband had planted to prove they were staying. She had warned them that the boundary description was wrong. She had shown them that a straight line could not follow a winding creek. Still the engines rose, the tracks rolled, and another tree folded into the dirt. Beyond the farmhouse, the access road stretched toward town, toward a bank that claimed the sale was legal, and records that someone did not want open. At Laverne did not scream. She stood perfectly still, watching the machine approach the next tree, because somewhere beneath the destruction was a truth written down long ago. There are feet 45 in the morning when Laverne Hadley heard the first sound. She was standing at the kitchen counter, waiting for the coffee to finish, watching the thin gray light come up over the eastern ridge the way it did every morning in Harlan County. The hills turned from black to purple to a dull, dusty green, and the apple trees behind the house went from silhouettes to something real, something she could count the branches of if she stood there long enough. She had done this every morning for 44 years. First with Denton standing beside her, then without him. The sound came from far down the road. A low diesel rumble, the kind that travels through the ground before it travels through the air. She thought it was a feed truck that had taken the wrong turn off Route 9. It happened sometimes. She poured her coffee, added nothing to it, and turned toward the window. Then she heard the fence go. Not a slow creak, not the sound of old wood giving way to wind or weather. It was a crack like a rifle shot followed by a long, splintering tear, and then the particular silence that follows when something that has stood for a long time stops standing. Laverne set her cup down on the counter. She did not run. She walked to the front door, opened it, and stepped onto the porch in her house shoes. Three machines. That was the first thing she counted. Three yellow machines sitting on what had been her north pasture, their engines running, their blades already tilted forward. The fence Denton had repaired the autumn before he got sick was gone. Not damaged. Gone. Pushed into a pile of broken boards and bent wire at the edge of the road like it had never been anything at all. Laverne stood on the porch and did not move for a long moment. Later, she would think about why she did not scream, why she did not run out into the field waving her arms. The honest answer was the same one she had learned the morning 3 years ago when she walked into the bedroom and found Denton lying still with his hands folded on his chest as if he had arranged himself that way on purpose. There is a moment in the worst moments of a life when the brain simply refuses to believe what the eyes are sending it. It goes quiet. It recalculates. It searches for the explanation that makes the thing not true. Laverne stood on that porch and searched and came up empty, and then she walked down the steps and across the yard toward the man in the orange vest, who was standing beside the lead machine holding a clipboard. His name was Hawthorne Webb, though she did not know that yet. He was around 40, broad-shouldered, with a face that was not unkind. He saw her coming, and he did not look away. That was something she would think later. He did not look away. She stopped 6 feet from him and said, "What are you doing on my land?" It was not a question. Hawthorne Webb held out a stack of papers. "Ma'am, I am sorry to be here under these circumstances. Pinnacle Development purchased this property through a court-authorized bank auction 2 days ago. I have the transfer documents right here. Everything was filed with the county. The demolition order was issued yesterday morning." Laverne did not take the papers. She looked at him for a moment, then looked past him at the machines, then looked back at him. "Show me the boundary description," she said. "The northern boundary line." He paused, then opened the top sheet and turned it toward her, pointing to the section that described the parcel. Laverne leaned forward and read it, slowly moving her lips slightly, the way she always did when she was reading something that mattered. Her finger traced the line that described the northern edge of the property. Then she straightened up and looked at Hawthorne Webb and said, "This boundary follows a straight line." "Yes, ma'am. The northern boundary of my land follows Redbud Creek. The creek does not run straight. It has not run straight in 60 years. Whoever wrote this description was not describing my farm." Hawthorne Webb looked down at the paper. He looked at it for a few seconds longer than he needed to. Then he looked back at her, and something in his expression shifted. Some small thing moved behind his eyes. He did not say she was wrong. He also did not say she was right. He said, "Ma'am, I have a demolition order and a signed transfer document. I have to proceed." Laverne looked at him steadily. "Then proceed," she said. "But you are making a mistake." She turned and walked back toward the house. She did not look back at the machines. She walked up the porch steps through the front door and stood in the kitchen with both hands flat on the counter and her eyes closed for a count of 10. When she opened them, the coffee was still there. She picked it up and drank it cold. Behind her through the kitchen window, she heard the machine start moving again. This was Denton's land, not in some sentimental abstract way, in the specific documented, legally recorded way that a man can make a thing his by working it and paying taxes on it and measuring its corners and writing down the measurements and doing all of this year after year for 50 years without ever once missing a payment or a deadline or a line in a ledger. Denton Hadley had been a man of 8 years of school and 40 years of work, and one fundamental belief, which was that the truth, if you wrote it down carefully enough, would eventually outlast the people who wanted to ignore it. He had bought the farm in 1961 from the estate of an old man named Purvis, who had farmed it without a deed for 30 years before that. Denton was 23 years old and had saved $4,000 working at the grain elevator in Middlesbrough. The parcel was surveyed that same year by a county land surveyor named Absalom Farr, a young man on his first independent job, who measured the northern boundary by following the natural line of Redbud Creek, and noted in his map that the creek curved 14 feet eastward at the northeast corner of the property. Denton had been there while Farr did the measuring. Denton had walked the entire boundary with him and measured it himself afterward with his own strides because he wanted to know every inch of what he owned. In 1987, after a small spring flood shifted the creek bed by 3 feet, Denton had remeasured the entire northern boundary himself and sent a letter to the county surveying office noting the change. He had kept a copy of the letter. He had kept a copy of everything. The apple trees he planted that same year, 12 of them in a row behind the house, a variety called winesap that his mother had grown in her own garden in Pineville. He had told Laverne when he set the first one in the ground that he was planting them because apples took 10 years to come into real production, and he wanted to plant something that proved he was planning to stay. When the trees were finally taller than the roof line, he had stood in the yard and looked at them with his hands on his hips and said nothing. He did not need to. Laverne had watered those trees every morning for the past 3 years since he was gone, not because she particularly loved the taste of apples, because of what they were. She heard the sound from the back of the house before she got to the window. A cracking, splintering sound she recognized in her chest before her mind named it. She went to the back window and stood there and looked out. The first 2 trees in the row were already down. The machine had taken them from the east end working methodically, and the roots had come up out of the ground with clods of dark soil still clinging to them. The first tree, the one Denton had planted first, was lying on its side with its roots in the air, reaching up toward nothing. Laverne's hands went to the edge of the window frame. She held the wood until her knuckles changed color. That was the only thing she allowed herself. She stood there for a full minute, and she did not make a sound, and then she straightened, let go of the window frame, and walked back through the house to find her good coat. She had a bank to visit. Harlan County Savings Bank sat on the main square in Harlan, a 2-story brick building with a flagpole out front and a row of potted plants along the entrance that someone watered with perhaps too much enthusiasm. Laverne had banked there for 40 years. Denton had banked there before her. She knew the building the way you know any place you have entered regularly over decades without thinking about it, the way your feet know a familiar floor. She pushed through the glass door at 9:15 in the morning. The branch was maybe a third full, a young teller at the far window. 2 people in the loan office through the glass partition. A man in a suit talking on his phone near the coffee station. And at a desk near the back wall, a young man with dark hair bent over a computer screen, his face close to the monitor as if he were reading something very carefully. Laverne went to the main counter and set down the single piece of paper she had brought with her. It was Denton's original record sheet handwritten with the parcel number 003254 and his notes about the boundary, including the notation about Redbud Creek. The paper was yellow at the edges and soft from decades of handling, but every word on it was clear. The teller was a young woman who looked at the paper and then at Laverne with the particular expression of someone who is about to escalate a situation to a manager. Laverne explained quietly and precisely. There were machines on her land. The bank appeared to have sold a property that it did not own. She would like to speak with whoever was responsible for the auction that had taken place 2 days ago. The manager came out 3 minutes later. Montgomery Drum was 54 years old with silver hair and the practiced ease of a man who had spent 3 decades making people feel that every decision he made was in their best interest. He wore a dark blue suit and a tie with a small pattern that was probably expensive. He extended his hand to Laverne and shook hers firmly and said, "Mrs. Hadley, why don't we step somewhere quiet?" They stood at the small consultation table near the window, rather than going into his office. Laverne noted that. He had chosen a place where he could be seen from the main floor. She laid the paper on the table and told him the same thing she had told the teller. The machines on the land, the boundary description, and the transfer document that listed a straight line instead of the creek. The parcel number on Denton's record sheet that matched the parcel number being developed. Drum listened with both hands folded on the table. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he looked up at her with an expression she could not immediately name. She identified it a second later. It was the expression of a man preparing to be kind. He said, "Mrs. Hadley, I want to be very respectful here because I can see that this situation has been distressing. We do occasionally see cases in older rural communities where longtime residents become understandably confused about adjacent parcels. Property lines in this county go back well over 100 years, and the records can be difficult to interpret without professional guidance." Someone near the coffee station let out a short laugh. Laverne kept her eyes on Drum. "I would like to see the original parcel records for parcels 003-254 and 003-254A, she said, "side by side. I understand your concern, but what you have there," and he nodded toward Denton's paper, "is a personal notation, not a legal instrument. Our auction was based on properly filed documents that have been verified through our standard procedures. Your standard procedures recorded a straight northern boundary on land that borders a creek," Laverne said. "I'm asking you to show me the original record so we can determine whether there has been an error." Drum leaned back slightly. The room had gotten quieter. He said, "I think what would be most helpful is if you took some time to review the situation with a family member or someone who can help you navigate the documentation. We are certainly happy to answer questions through proper channels." He stood up. The conversation was over as far as he was concerned. Laverne picked up Denton's paper from the table. She folded it along the original crease and put it in her coat pocket. She looked at Montgomery Drum for a moment without speaking. Then she said, "Thank you for your time," and she walked toward the front door. She was halfway across the main floor when something made her slow her step without quite stopping. From the desk near the back wall, the young man who had been looking so closely at his screen had turned in his chair. He was looking at her. When she glanced toward him, he did not look away. His face was careful and still the face of someone thinking something he was not going to say out loud. She pushed through the glass door and walked to her truck. Back at his desk, Hollis Slade turned to his monitor and typed the parcel number into the internal document system. He had been working at Harlan County Savings Bank for 14 months, and he was 28 years old, and he was not yet skilled at pretending he had not noticed things he had noticed. 3 days before the auction, during his routine review of the auction file, he had seen 2 entries in the system. One labeled 003-254A, listed as the foreclosed property the bank had the legal right to sell. One labeled 003-254, which pulled up a different record entirely, one with an active address with tax payments current to the previous year, with the name Hadley across the top. He had printed both records and brought them to Montgomery Drum and laid them side by side on Drum's desk and said he thought there might be a discrepancy worth checking before the auction. Drum had looked at the 2 printouts for a moment and then looked up at him and said, "Hollis, our file shows a clean title. The digital record is the current authorized document. Whatever that other entry is, it is a data artifact from an old migration. We are not going to delay a major auction over a scanning error." Hollis had taken the printouts back to his desk and put them in his drawer. Now he sat at his computer and looked at both records again, and looked at the door through which Laverne Hadley had just walked out, and felt the particular discomfort of a man who has done the thing that was expected of him, and found that it does not sit the way he thought it would. He stood up. He walked to Drum's office and knocked on the open door. Drum looked up from his desk with the slightly impatient expression of a man who has just handled one problem and is already planning the next thing. "She was right about the creek," Hollis said. "I looked up the 1961 survey. The northern boundary of 003254 follows Redbud Creek. Our auction document has a straight line. Drum looked at him for a long moment without speaking. Then he said, "Close the door." Hollis closed the door. What was said in that room in the next 4 minutes, Laverne Hadley did not know. She was already in her truck driving west out of Harlan, heading toward the dirt road that led to Kennard Pickett's place. What she knew was the shape of what she had seen on the main floor when she looked back. The young man turning away from his screen, the particular angle of his shoulders, the expression of someone who was trying to decide something. She recognized it because she had seen Denton wear that expression in the last year of his life when the diagnosis came back, and they sat together in the kitchen, and he looked at her across the table with that same careful stillness, working out in his mind what he needed to do next to make sure she would be all right. The truck moved through the morning light, and Laverne kept her eyes on the road and thought about what Denton had always said, which was that the truth, if you wrote it down carefully enough, would eventually outlast the people who were trying to ignore it. She had been in that bank. She had set the evidence on the table. She had said what needed to be said. Now she needed to know what else she had. Back in Drum's office, the door was closed. Drum sat behind his desk with his hands folded and said, "I need you to go back to your desk and not discuss this with anyone. I am going to have our legal team pull the full documentation chain this afternoon, and we are going to get a clear picture of exactly what we are dealing with." Hollis said, "And if there is an error?" Drum said, "Then we will handle it through the appropriate process. That is not your concern right now. Your concern is to do your job and trust that the people whose job it is to manage risk are managing it." Hollis went back to his desk. He did not take the printouts out of his drawer again. He put his hands on the keyboard and stared at the screen and did not type anything for a long time. In Drum's office, the legal team was called. The documentation chain was pulled. Within 20 minutes, the answer was on Drum's desk in the form of a single-page comparison that made his face go the color of old concrete. Parcel 003-254A. The foreclosed property the bank had been authorized to sell was a vacant lot on the east side of the county, near the new commercial route. Parcel 003-254 was the Hadley farm with a house on it with a family and residence for 60 years, with tax payments current to the last calendar year. One character dropped when the county moved its land records from paper to digital. And no one had checked. No one had put the original paper record next to the digital entry and compared them before scheduling an auction. Drum sat with the page in front of him. Outside his window, the flagpole stood against the sky that had turned the flat white of a Tennessee November. His name was on a placard in front of the County Chamber of Commerce building across the square. He was on the board of 3 local organizations. He had been at this bank for 19 years. He picked up his phone and called Lysander Crane. Lysander Crane had been the director of the Harlan County Land Records Office for 11 years. He and Montgomery Drum had known each other for 20, had sat at the same tables at the same events, had helped each other with small things over the years, in the way that men in positions of local authority sometimes accumulate favors between them like a kind of informal currency. Drum did not explain the whole situation. He said there was an issue with a property file that was likely to generate records requests from a third party in the next few days, and he needed those requests to move slowly while his team worked out the details. Lysander Crane listened. He said, "Okay, Monty." That was all. 2 words. The machine had already been set in motion on the farm. Pinnacle Development's contract had been signed. The wire transfer had cleared. And now the one office where Laverne Hadley might find the documentation she needed had quietly agreed to slow its doors. What Montgomery Drum did not know, and what Lysander Crane did not know, and what no one at Harlan County Savings Bank knew was that Denton Hadley had spent 50 years anticipating exactly this kind of day. Not this specific day, not this specific mistake, but someday in some form when the written record of his ownership would be the only thing standing between his family and the casual violence of institutional error. Laverne was not in her kitchen. She was not at the bank. She was driving down a dirt road toward an old man's house, and in her coat pocket was a piece of paper that Denton had folded 60 years ago. And in his house at the end of that road, in a knotty pine room that smelled of machine oil and old coffee, Kennard Pickett sat on his front porch with a wrench in his hand and a water pump in pieces at his feet and watched her truck come up the road raising dust. He set the wrench down when she got out of the truck. He looked at her face and knew it was not a social visit. Tell me, he said. She told him. Kennard Pickett had served as a deputy county clerk for 11 years, and then as a senior clerk for 19 more, and he had retired 5 years ago with a thorough and somewhat weary understanding of how county government operated in practice as opposed to in theory. He listened to Laverne without interrupting, and when she finished, he looked out over the fields toward where the Hadley property was and was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Denton knew something I never quite gave him credit for knowing. He picked the wrench back up and turned it in his hands. Lysander Crane is running that office now. Lysander is not a bad man, but Lysander is a man who knows which way his bread is buttered, and if Montgomery Drum called him, which I suspect he did, the front door of that records office will find ways to stay closed. He looked up at her. You can still go. You should go. But you need to understand what you are walking into, and you need to know what to ask for. He put the wrench down again. There are two kinds of records in that building. The digital files, which any clerk can restrict access to with a system flag and a phone call, and the original paper records in the physical archive, which go back to the beginning of the county and which you cannot make disappear without physically removing them, which is a crime that nobody is going to commit over a real estate deal. He paused. If Lysander is covering for Drum, he will use the digital side to slow you down. He will not touch the paper archive, which means if you can get a court order, the truth is still in that building. Laverne looked at him. How do I get a court order? You need a lawyer, Kennard said, and you need evidence strong enough that a lawyer will take the case. He looked at her steadily. Laverne, Denton kept records, didn't he? She looked back at him for a moment. Then she stood up without saying anything and walked to her truck and drove back toward what remained of her house. The land records office opened at 8:30 and Laverne was standing at the door at 8:25. She had not slept, not in the way sleep is supposed to work, where you lie down and the body takes over and the mind goes somewhere else for a few hours. She had lain in the dark in Kennard Pickett's spare room because her own house had no roof over the back half anymore, and she had stared at the ceiling and thought about what she knew and what she still needed and in what order she needed to get it. When the sky outside the window went from black to the particular dark blue that comes before dawn, she had gotten up and made coffee and sat at Kennard's kitchen table with Denton's paper in front of her and waited for morning to become morning. Kennard came downstairs at 7 and found her there and did not say anything about the fact that she looked like she had not closed her eyes. He poured his own coffee and sat across from her and said, Brenda Cook works the front counter Tuesdays. She does what she is told. Lysander will have talked to her already. He paused. You remember what I said about the Form 17C? I remember. You ask for the form. You fill it out in front of them. You request the original paper records, not the digital file. And when they stall, you ask for a written denial with a signature. Laverne looked at him. Will they give me one? Kennard wrapped both hands around his mug. No, but the fact that they won't will tell you exactly what you need to know. She drove to the county seat alone. Kennard had offered to come and she had told him no, not because she did not want the company, but because she needed to walk into that building as herself as Laverne Hadley of Hadley Farm, not as an old woman being escorted somewhere by a neighbor. There was a difference and it mattered. The records office was in the east wing of the county building, a low brick structure from the 1960s with fluorescent lights that hummed at a frequency that got into your back teeth if you stood under them too long. Laverne pushed through the glass door at 8:28 and took a position near the counter. At 8:30, exactly, a woman in her early 40s with reading glasses on a beaded chain came out from the back and unlocked the interior gate. Brenda Cook. She looked at Laverne and her face did the thing Kennard had predicted. A small adjustment, a slight recalibration, the look of someone who has been told to expect a particular person and is now confirming the identification. Good morning, Laverne said. I would like a Form 17C, please. I am requesting access to the original paper records for parcel 003254. Brenda Cook sat down at her terminal and began typing. She typed for longer than a records query should take. Then she looked up and said, I am showing that parcel as currently involved in an active transaction. Our system is in maintenance mode for files associated with active transactions. I am not able to process a retrieval request at this time. I understand, Laverne said. I would like the Form 17C anyway, please. I would like to make the request in writing. A pause. The form would still be subject to the same restriction. Yes, I would still like to fill it out. Brenda Cook looked at her for a moment, then opened a drawer, took out a single sheet of paper and slid it across the counter. Laverne filled it out in her careful handwriting, every field, including the section that required the specific record being requested and the legal basis for the request. She slid it back. Brenda took it to the back. Laverne stood at his counter and waited. The fluorescent lights hummed. A young man came in to request a plat map for a different parcel and was helped immediately and left inside of 4 minutes. Laverne stood and waited. 12 minutes later, Lysander Crane came through the door from the back office. She recognized him. She had seen him at county events over the years at the fair at the agricultural extension meetings Denton used to attend. He was 61 with the build of a man who had once been athletic and had not entirely let it go, and he had the careful courtesy of someone who had spent 30 years in public service and learned to make refusals feel like assistance. He extended his hand. "Mrs. Hadley, I am sorry to hear you have been having a difficult week. Why don't we sit down?" They sat at the small table near the window. Lysander Crane set her Form 17C on the table between them and folded his hands over it in a way that was not quite placing it back in her reach. He said that under Tennessee Administrative Code, records associated with properties currently undergoing legal transfer proceedings were subject to a review hold that restricted third-party access until the transfer was finalized or contested through the court system. He said this calmly and with the ease of a man reciting something he had said before. Laverne said, "The transfer is what I am contesting. The records I am requesting are the original survey documents and ownership chain for parcel 003254, which I believe was sold in error. Access to those records is the only way to verify whether an error occurred." Lysander Crane said, "I understand your position and I want to be helpful here. If you believe there has been an error in the transfer, the appropriate channel is to file a formal complaint with the county court, at which point the court can issue an order for record disclosure. We would be fully cooperative with any such order. Will you provide me with a written denial of my Form 17C with your signature?" Lysander Crane was quiet for a moment. The fluorescent lights hummed. Somewhere in the back of the office, a phone rang twice and stopped. He said, "What I can give you is a written notice explaining the administrative hold and directing you to the appropriate court process." "That is not what I asked for. I asked for a written denial of the specific request I made on the form signed by you as the director of this office." Lysander Crane looked at her. She looked back at him. His hands were still folded over her Form 17C. He said, "I don't believe a signed denial is the appropriate document in this situation." Laverne said, "I know you knew Denton Hadley." Something moved across Lysander Crane's face. It was brief, and he controlled it quickly. He said, "I don't have information relevant to that." Laverne nodded. She stood up. She said, "Thank you for your time, Mr. Crane." She walked out through the glass door and into the parking lot. She did not look back, but she had been watching the window of Lysander Crane's office as she crossed the lot, and she saw what she expected to see. He was on the phone before she reached her truck. His mouth was moving, and his eyes were following her all the way to the driver's side door. She sat in the truck and called Kennard. "He is calling Drum right now," she said. "He would not sign the denial." Kennard said, "Good. That is what we needed to know." A pause. "Come home. I have a phone number for you." The auction had already happened. Laverne had not been there for most of it. She had driven past the auction hall on her way back from Harlan the day before, and she had seen the cars in the lot, and she had made a decision that she would go in and say what needed to be said, even knowing it would not stop anything, because she needed the record to show that she had tried. That she had stood up in a room full of people and said, "This land is mine," before anyone could claim later that she had stayed silent. She had worn Denton's gift, the navy wool coat he had driven to Knoxville to buy for their 25th anniversary, the one she had told him was too expensive, and he had bought anyway, and hung on the back of the bedroom door with a bow on the hanger. She had worn it twice in 3 years. She wore it now because she was walking into a room full of people who had already decided she did not matter, and she wanted to walk in as someone who knew her own worth. The auction hall was a converted warehouse on the commercial strip east of town. When Laverne pushed through the door, the room was arranged with chairs facing a low stage, and perhaps 60 people were seated or standing along the walls. Men in suits, men in business casual, a woman with a tablet making notes near the stage. The room had the energy of money-changing hands, the particular focus of people who had come to acquire something. Laverne took a seat near the back. She did not look for Drum right away. She looked for exits. She looked at the faces of the people around her and thought about who among them was actually going to build something on her land and who was just here to watch the number go up. The man at the front began describing the property: location near the new commercial route, development potential, favorable zoning. He used the word opportunity 4 times in the first 2 minutes. Laverne stood up. She said, "I want to formally object to this auction. The property being described may not belong to this bank. The northern boundary in the documents on file does not match the actual surveyed boundary of parcel 003-254. The room went quiet the way rooms do when something unexpected enters them. Laverne stood straight and kept her voice level and did not look at the faces turning toward her. Montgomery Drum appeared at the side of the stage. He had been there the whole time, she realized, standing just to the right of the curtain waiting. He walked to the microphone with the measured pace of a man who has prepared for this exact moment. He said, "Ladies and gentlemen, want to assure everyone here that all documentation for this property has been thoroughly verified through our legal department and through county records. We understand that transitions of this kind can sometimes be distressing for nearby residents, and we have every compassion for that. But this auction is proceeding on the basis of valid, legally filed documents." Someone near Laverne murmured something to the person beside them. A man in the third row turned around and looked at her with the mild curiosity of someone watching a small disruption resolve itself. 2 men in matching gray polo shirts appeared at Laverne's side. Security. One of them put his hand gently but firmly on her elbow and said, "Ma'am, I need to ask you to step outside." Laverne did not pull away. She allowed herself to be walked toward the door. But before she reached it, she said loudly enough for the front rows to hear, "The northern boundary in your documents follows a straight line. Redbud Creek does not run straight." She was through the door before she could hear whether anyone responded. She stood in the parking lot in the November air and looked back at the building for a moment. Then she walked to her truck. She sat behind the wheel and put her hands in her lap and thought about what had just happened. In the past 48 hours, she had been dismissed by a bank manager in front of a lobby full of people, turned away from a government office without the documents she needed, and removed from a public auction. She had done everything that could reasonably be done through the front door, and every front door had been closed. In the back row of the auction hall, a young man with dark hair sat with his phone under the lip of the chair. In front of him, the screen angled away from the people on either side. He had pulled up the county hydrological survey map for Harlan County. Redbud Creek ran across the screen in a blue line that curved and bent and never ran straight for more than 30 yards at a time. He stared at it for a moment, then took a screenshot and put his phone in his pocket. He had told himself he had come here to see how it went. He knew sitting there with the screenshot on his phone and the sound of the auctioneer starting the bidding back up again, that he had not come here for that reason at all. The auction closed at 1:40 in the afternoon. Pinnacle Development won the bid. The next morning, the machines came back. Laverne was at Kennard's house when she heard them. She had been watching from the window since first light because she could see the tree line of her property from Kennard's kitchen, and she had known they would come back. When the sound started, she put her coffee cup down and walked out to the porch and stood there. Kennard came and stood beside her. Neither of them said anything. The cattle shed went first. Denton had built the original frame of it the second summer after he bought the land and had rebuilt it after the ice storm of 1994, and it had stood through every winter since with the patient solidity of something constructed by a man who expected it to outlast him. The machine that took it did not struggle. It simply pushed, and the wall gave way and the roof came down, and then the machine pushed again, and it was over. The vegetable garden had already been scraped. The raised beds Denton had framed with railroad ties, the beds where Laverne had grown tomatoes and green beans, and the particular variety of sweet corn Denton had brought back from a seed exchange in Barbourville were gone. The railroad ties were pushed to the side in a pile. The soil was smooth and flat and orange under the tire tracks. Laverne walked the half-mile to the bank for the last time. She walked in through the glass door in her work clothes with dirt on the knees from where she had knelt beside what used to be her garden fence. Drum was already walking toward the main floor when Laverne came in, which meant someone had called ahead, which meant she was being watched. He said, "Mrs. Hadley, I understand you are very distressed, and I genuinely want to help you find the right path forward here." She said, "Stop the demolition until the records dispute is resolved." He said, "The transaction is complete. The property has legally changed hands. Demolition and development are within the rights of the new owner. She said, "You know there was an error." He looked at her with an expression she had not seen from him before. Not the practiced patience of the first visit, something closer to discomfort. He said, "If you believe there has been an error in a legal proceeding, the appropriate remedy is to file a legal challenge through the courts. We have no authority to halt a private development based on an unsubstantiated claim." Laverne looked at him for a long time. She looked at him the way you look at something you are memorizing because you will need the memory later. Then she said thank you, and she walked out. She drove back to her house. Not Canard's house. Her house, what was left of it. The front half still stood. The porch was intact. She sat on the porch steps and looked out at the field where the cattle shed used to be, in the place where the garden had been, and the corner of the yard where two of the apple trees still stood, because the machines had not gotten to the western end of the row yet. She thought about what Drum had said. The courts, the legal process. She had no lawyer. She had no money to hire a lawyer because the farm was her income and her income was gone. She had Canard's offer of what he had saved, which was not much, and she had the knowledge that every official channel in this county had a door that would close before she could get through it. She went inside. She walked through the front room and the kitchen and opened the door to the storage room behind the kitchen, the small room with the low ceiling that Denton had called the keeping room because he said it was where you kept the things that mattered. The machines had not reached this part of the house. The roof was intact. The walls were solid. In the corner stacked against the far wall were 3 wooden boxes. Denton had built them himself from the same pine he used for the shelving in the barn. Each one had a label on the side in his handwriting, written in the black marker he kept in the kitchen drawer. The first label read 1961 to 1970. The second read 1971 to 1990. The third read 1991 to 2010. Laverne had not opened these boxes in 3 years. She had known they were here. Denton had told her what was in them and why he kept them, had explained it to her the way he explained everything practical, without drama, the way you explain where the circuit breaker is or where the spare key is kept. He had told her that if anything ever happened with the land, everything she needed was in those boxes organized by year. She carried the first box to the kitchen table and opened it. Inside each year had its own envelope labeled in the same black marker. She lifted the first envelope and opened it and took out the papers inside. Property tax receipt for 1961 with the parcel number printed in the upper right corner. A letter from the county assessor's office confirming the assessed value and the owner of record. A hand-drawn sketch of the property boundary with notes in Denton's writing. She put it down and took out the 1962 envelope. Tax receipt, confirmation letter. A photograph of the original fence post at the northeast corner of the property with a handwritten note on the back giving the distance from the post to the nearest road marker. She went through every year in the first box without stopping. Not a single year was missing. Not a single property code was different. Every document named the same parcel, the same boundary, the same owner. Denton Hadley, then after 1963, Denton and Laverne Hadley. She set the first box down and opened the second. At the bottom of the second box, beneath the envelope for 1990, she found something that was not in an envelope. It was a folded piece of paper smaller than the others, creased many times, as if it had been carried in a pocket for a long time before being put away. She unfolded it. The handwriting was Denton's. No date at the top. It said, "Laverne, if you ever need to prove this land is ours, find Absalom Farr in Cookville. He is the man who surveyed this property in 1961. I hope he is still living. I have kept a copy of his original survey map in the tin tube under the floorboard at the east corner of the keeping room. He kept his own copy. He told me so when we walked the boundary together." Laverne sat down on the kitchen floor. She sat with her back against the cabinet in the paper in both hands, and she read it again. Then she read it a third time. Outside through the kitchen window, she could hear the machines still working, the low grinding sound of them moving across the field. The sound had been there all day, and she had pushed it to the back of her mind, but now she let herself hear it fully, let herself sit with it, and she felt the full weight of the past 2 days come down on her all at once. She did not make a sound. She did not shake. But her eyes filled and 2 tears ran down her face one after the other, and she let them go, because there was no one there to see them, and she was not ashamed of them. Denton had known, not that this exact thing would happen, but that something might someday, that the land might need defending, that she might be the one who had to defend it. And he had left her what she needed quietly without telling her because he understood her well enough to know that if he had told her, she would have said it was unnecessary and set the paper aside. She sat on that floor for 4 minutes. Then she stood up, put the paper in her coat pocket, and walked to Kennard's house. He was on the porch when she came up the road. He looked at her face and stood up from his chair. She took the paper out of her pocket and held it out to him. He took it and read it, and when he looked up, his eyes were different than they had been all day. Something in them that was not quite grief and not quite relief, but something between the two. He said quietly, "Absalom Farr." He was quiet for a moment. "I know that name. I worked with him once, years back, on a boundary dispute over in Bell County. He would be about 88 now." He looked up at her. "Laverne, he is still alive. He is in a care facility in Cookville. I saw his name in the County Surveyors Association newsletter last spring." She looked at him without speaking. He said, "That is a 3-hour drive." She said, "I know." He said, "I will go with you." She nodded. Then she said, "Kennard, I need a lawyer first. You mentioned a name." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "Winifred Voss, Nashville. She is a good lawyer. She is also a woman who has a specific history with Montgomery Drum from a case 10 years back that she lost in a way that most people in that courtroom thought was wrong. I do not know if she will take this. I do not know what she charges. I do know that if anyone in this state is going to stand up in a courtroom and go after Harlan County Savings Bank, it is probably her." Laverne said, "Call her." Kennard looked at her. "You sure?" Denton kept 50 years of records in pine boxes and wrote me a note to find a man in Cookville. I think we owe it to him to at least make the phone call. Kennard went inside to find his address book. Laverne sat down in his porch chair and looked out at the evening coming down over the ridge. The machines had stopped for the day. The sudden quiet was almost worse than the sound had been. In the silence, she could hear the creek at the bottom of the property, the one that wound along the northern boundary of her land, the water moving the way it always had and would keep moving long after every piece of paper in every box had turned to dust. She thought about Absalom Farr, 88 years old in a care facility in Cookville, who had walked her land with her husband 60 years ago and kept a copy of what he saw. She thought about the tin tube under the floorboard. She thought about what it meant that Denton had left her a map to a map. 300 miles away in Nashville, in a second-floor office above a dry cleaner on 8th Avenue, a young man named Hollis Slade sat in a waiting room chair with a laptop bag on his knees and waited for a name to be called. He had driven straight from Harlan after the auction. He had not told anyone at the bank where he was going. He had the printouts from the internal system in a folder inside the bag and a screenshot of a creek on his phone and the particular look of someone who has decided to do something that cannot be undone. The receptionist looked up and said, "Ms. Voss will see you now." That same night, 11 miles outside of Harlan, Lysander Crane's phone rang at 11 minutes past 11. He looked at the screen. He looked at his wife sleeping in the dark beside him. He got up quietly and went to the bathroom and closed the door and sat on the edge of the tub and answered it. Drum's voice said, "She hired Winifred Voss." Lysander Crane did not say anything for a moment. He looked at his hands in the bathroom light. Drum said, "I need you to be solid on this, Lysander. Nothing has changed. You held a standard administrative review on a contested file. That is all that happened." Lysander Crane looked at his hands for a long time. He said, "All right." He ended the call and sat on the edge of the tub in the quiet house and did not move for a long time. Down the hall, his wife breathed in her sleep. On the shelf above the sink was a photograph from the county clerk's retirement party in 2008, a group of people standing in a parking lot squinting into the sun. Denton Hadley was in that photograph. He was standing at the edge of the group with his hands in his pockets, slightly apart from everyone else the way he always was, looking at the camera with the expression of a man who was used to being present at things without needing to be at the center of them. Lysander Crane looked at that photograph for a long time. Then he turned off the bathroom light and went back to bed. They left for Cookville before the sun was fully up. Kennard drove because Laverne had not slept, and he knew it even though she had not said so. She sat in the passenger seat with the tin tube on her lap, the one she had pried up from the east corner of the keeping room floor the night before, and she held it without opening it. The morning came in gray and flat over the Cumberland Plateau, the kind of November morning that gives no warmth and makes no promises, and the truck moved through it steadily while neither of them felt the need to talk. Inside the tin tube sealed since Denton last closed it was Harold's copy of the original 1961 survey, still legible after 6 decades, with Absalom Farr's notations in pencil along the northern boundary and the small arrow marking where Redbud Creek bent east at the corner. Laverne had confirmed it was there the night before and then resealed it. She would open it in the right room with the right people present when it could do what it needed to do. They pulled into the Maplewood Care Facility in Cookville at 11:40 in the morning. It was a single-story building, set back from the road with a covered entrance and a row of bare maples along the parking lot. A woman at the front desk called back to the wing where Absalom Farr lived, and after a few minutes, a young aide led them down a corridor that smelled of floor wax and lunch cooking somewhere distant. Absalom Farr was on the covered patio at the end of the hall, sitting in a wheelchair with a crossword puzzle folded open on his lap and a pencil in his right hand. He was 88 years old and his hair had gone the color of January clouds, but his hands were steady, and his eyes, when he looked up at them, were clear and direct, the eyes of a man who had spent his life reading distances and had never lost the habit of precision. Laverne said his name and told him hers, and said that her husband had been Denton Hadley. Absalom Farr set the pencil down on the crossword without finishing the word he had been working on. He looked at her for a moment, and then something in his face settled into a different arrangement, the way a room looks when someone opens a window that has been closed a long time. He said, "Parcel 003254, 1961. I was 26 years old. It was the third job I had done on my own without a supervisor on site." He paused. "I measured that northern line twice. Your husband walked it with me the whole way." He did not say much, but he was watching everything. At the northeast corner, where the creek bends, I made a note in the margin of the map because that kind of natural boundary feature needs to be explicitly recorded, or it causes problems for decades. He looked at the tin tube in Laverne's hands. "Is that what I think it is?" She held it out to him. He took it with both hands and worked the stopper free with the ease of someone who had handled document tubes his entire professional life. He unrolled the map on his lap and looked at it for a long time without speaking. He traced the northern boundary line with one finger, following it to the northeast corner, and found his own penciled notation from 60 years ago. He read it silently. Then he looked up. He said, "Come with me." The aide helped him back inside to his room. From the bottom drawer of the dresser behind a stack of folded shirts, he took out a metal box. From the box, he took another tube identical in size to the one Laverne had brought, and from that tube, he removed his own copy of the same survey, the surveyor's copy, with his signature at the bottom right corner and the official stamp of the Harlan County Land Survey Office, dated August 14th, 1961. He laid both maps side by side on the bed. They were identical. Every line, every notation, every measurement. The northeast corner of parcel 003254, with the arrow indicating the bend of Redbud Creek 14 feet to the east. Denton's copy and Absalom Farr's copy separated by 60 years and 200 miles of Tennessee highway, telling exactly the same story. Kennard Pickett stood in the doorway of the room and looked at the two maps on the bed and did not say a word. Absalom Farr looked up at Laverne and said, "What happened to the farm?" She told him. She told him all of it. The auction, the machines, the bank, the records office, the forms and the phone calls and the doors that closed. She told him about Winifred Voss and about the lawsuit that had been filed 3 days ago and the hearing that was scheduled for the following week. She told him without embellishment the way she had told everything since this began, in the plain declarative sentences of a woman who understood that the facts did not need decoration to be devastating. When she finished, Absalom Farr sat quietly for a moment. Then he said, "I am 88 years old. I cannot make that drive. But I can sit in front of a camera and say what I know, and what I know is that I stood on that land in 1961, and I measured it, and I drew it, and I signed my name to it, and the creek was the northern boundary, and has been the northern boundary since before either of us was born." He looked at her steadily. "I kept a copy of every job I ever did. 62 years of work. A surveyor's record is a permanent thing, and a man should be able to stand behind his permanent things." He picked up his pencil from where he had left it on the crossword. "Tell your lawyer I am ready when she is." Winifred Voss recorded Absalom Farr's testimony on a Thursday afternoon via video call, with a court reporter present at both ends and the two maps positioned on a document stand where the camera could read them clearly. She asked him about the survey, about the specific notation at the northeast corner, about his professional qualifications and his record-keeping practices. He answered every question with the calm precision of a man who had been waiting without knowing it for someone to ask. When the recording ended, Winifred sat back in her chair in her Nashville office and looked at the screen for a moment after the connection closed. Then she looked at Hollis Slade, who was sitting across the desk from her and had been working in her office for 6 days, and she said, "We are ready." The hearing was held on a Tuesday in the Harlan County Circuit Court in a room on the second floor of the courthouse with tall windows that let in the thin winter light. The gallery was perhaps half full, which for a civil proceeding in a county this size was unusual. Word had traveled the way word traveled in small places through the feed store and the diner and the parking lots of churches that Laverne Hadley was taking the bank to court over her farm. The farm that had been in her family for 60 years, the one they had torn down while she was still living in it. Laverne sat at the plaintiff's table in her navy coat. Winifred Voss sat beside her with 3 folders open and a legal pad covered in handwriting. Across the aisle, Ingram Galt, 52, silver-haired in a suit that announced its own quality, without being loud about it, sat with 2 associates and a stack of binders that suggested a team that had prepared for a siege. Montgomery Drum sat at the defense table in his own suit, his hands folded on the table, his face arranged in the expression of a man who has been advised to project calm. The judge was a woman named Hartwell, 60 years old, who had presided over this circuit for 14 years. She had read the filings. She did not look like a person who intended to let this morning move slowly. Ingram Galt went first. He was good at his job and he did not waste time on things that were not going to help him. He acknowledged that a data discrepancy existed between the 2 parcel numbers. He argued that the discrepancy was an administrative artifact, a legacy of a record digitization process, and that the auction itself had been conducted in full compliance with all applicable legal procedures based on the documentation available at the time. He argued that Mrs. Hadley's tax records, while consistent, did not in themselves constitute proof of legal ownership sufficient to void a completed property transaction. He argued that the appropriate remedy, if any remedy was warranted, was financial compensation, not reversal of the sale. He spoke for 22 minutes. He was precise and measured, and he never once raised his voice. Winifred waited until he sat down. Then she stood up and walked to the evidence table and picked up a single document, 1 page, and handed it to the court clerk to mark as Exhibit 1. She said, "Your Honor, I'm not going to argue about the auction procedures. I'm going to ask one question. Did Harlan County Savings Bank have the legal right to sell parcel 003254? She let that sit for a moment. To answer that question, I am going to ask the court to order the county land records office to produce the original paper survey documents in ownership chain for both parcel 003254A and parcel 003254 from the physical archive, not the digital system." Judge Hartwell looked at the filing. She looked at Galt. She said, "Mr. Galt, is there an objection?" Galt said there was no objection to production of records, but that the timeline should allow for proper retrieval procedures. The judge said the records would be produced by Friday. In the records office across the square, Lysander Crane received the court order at 2:15 in the afternoon. He sat at his desk with it in front of him and thought about the phone call he had received 11 days ago and the one he had received 3 nights ago, and the conversation he had had with his own lawyer that morning, which had ended with his lawyer saying quietly and without drama that Lysander needed to think very carefully about what he was willing to put his name on in a court proceeding. Lysander Crane thought about Denton Hadley's face in the photograph on his bathroom shelf. He called his lawyer back and said he needed to talk. The records arrived at the courthouse on Friday in a sealed box carried by a clerk from the archive division, a young woman who had nothing to do with any of what had happened and who set the box on the clerk's table with the careful neutrality of someone delivering something she understood was important without knowing exactly why. The second hearing was the following Tuesday. When the box was opened in court and the records laid out on the evidence table, Winifred asked the court's permission to walk Judge Hartwell through the comparison. The judge granted it. Winifred placed the 2 original paper records side by side. Parcel 003254A, the foreclosed property, a vacant lot on the east side of the county, no structures, no residents, tax payments in arrears for 4 years. Parcel 003254, the Hadley Farm continuous owner of record, since 1961 structures on property. Tax payments current to the previous calendar year address listed as occupied. She said the property the bank was authorized to sell was 003254A. The property the bank sold was 003254. These are two different pieces of land. The error originated in a data entry when the county moved its land records from paper to digital and was never caught because no one compared the digital record to the original paper document before scheduling the auction. The courtroom was quiet. Ingram Gott said, "Your Honor, this establishes an administrative error. It does not establish that the bank acted in bad faith. Errors of this kind occur in large-scale record migrations, and the appropriate response is correction and compensation, not reversal of a completed transaction." Winifred said, "Your Honor, I would like to call Hollis Slade." Hollis Slade walked from the gallery to the witness stand. He was 28 years old and he was wearing the same jacket he had worn to every day of work at the bank for the past 14 months, because it was the only good jacket he owned, and he had not had time to buy another one. He sat down and looked at Winifred and did not look at Montgomery Drum. He told the court what he had found 3 days before the auction. The two entries in the system, side by side, one flagged for sale and one showing an occupied property with an active address. He told the court that he had printed both records and brought them to Montgomery Drum and laid them on his desk and said he thought there was a discrepancy worth checking. He told the court what Drum had said. Winifred handed Exhibit 7 to the clerk. "This is an internal email from Montgomery Drum to the bank's legal department sent the afternoon that Mrs. Hadley visited the bank. The subject line reads, 'Please review full documentation chain for auction file.' Can you tell the court what this email establishes?" Hollis said, "It establishes that after Mrs. Hadley came in to report a possible error, Mr. Drum ordered an internal review. The auction proceeded the following morning." Ingram Galt was on his feet. "Objection. The witness is characterizing the content of a review he was not part of." Judge Hartwell said, "Sustained as to the characterization, Mr. Slade, please limit your testimony to what you directly observed." Winifred said, "Mr. Slade, after Mrs. Hadley visited the bank, did the auction proceed as scheduled?" Hollis said, "Yes." Winifred said, "No further questions." She sat down. Laverne, sitting beside her, looked at the window. The light coming in from the courthouse square was the flat gray of a November afternoon in Tennessee, and through the glass she could see the bare tops of the oak trees that lined the sidewalk, their branches stripped clean by the season. Ingram Gott stood for cross-examination and established that Hollis had no direct knowledge of what the internal review had found, that he had not been present for any conversation between Drum and the legal department, and that his testimony established at most that an internal review was ordered. Hollis agreed with all of this calmly because it was true, and because the email was still Exhibit 7 and it was still in the record. Then Winifred said, "Your Honor, I would like to call Lysander Crane." The room changed temperature. Lysander Crane came from the gallery where he had been sitting since the beginning of the hearing. He had not sat with the defense. He had not sat with the plaintiff. He had sat 3 rows back on the right side alone in a gray jacket, and he had been still the entire morning in the way of someone who has made a decision and is waiting for the moment to act on it. He settled into the witness stand and looked out at the room. His lawyer was in the gallery. They had talked for a long time over several days. Lysander had told his lawyer everything. His lawyer had told him what his options were. Lysander had chosen. Winifred walked him through the chronology. The phone call from Drum on the evening of the day Laverne visited the bank. The content of that call, what Drum had asked him to do, what Lysander had agreed to do. She asked him about Laverne's visit to the records office the following morning, about the Form 17C, about his decision not to provide a written denial. Lysander answered every question directly. His voice was even. He did not look at Drum. He said that Drum had told him the property in question was vacant and abandoned, that there was no one living on it, that slowing the records request was simply a way of preventing confusion during a complex transaction. He said he had believed that, or had told himself he believed it. He said that when he later understood the full situation, that there was a woman living on that land, that her husband had owned it for 60 years, that it was being physically demolished while she was being turned away from the records office, he had wanted to correct what he had done. He said he had waited too long to do it. He paused, then he said, "I knew Denton Hadley, not well, but I knew him. He was a decent man. I should not have agreed to what Drum asked me to do. I knew it when he asked, and I did it anyway. The room was absolutely still. Ingram Galt's cross-examination established that Lysander had not been told explicitly that a fraud was being committed, that he had believed the situation was a routine administrative hold, and that his agreement to slow the records request was a professional judgment call in an ambiguous situation. Lysander agreed that he had understood it as a professional judgment call. He did not agree that the situation had been genuinely ambiguous. Montgomery Drum took the witness stand after the lunch recess. Ingram Galt led him through the bank's procedures, the auction filing process, the documentation chain, the ways in which the error could reasonably have been missed by a department processing dozens of similar transactions each quarter. Drum spoke with the measured confidence of a man who has been well prepared, who has rehearsed his answers, who knows where the solid ground is and intends to stay on it. Then Winifred stood up. She stood at the plaintiff's table rather than walking toward him, and she spoke across the open space of the courtroom in a voice that was quiet enough to require attention. She said, "Mr. Drum, when Hollis Slade brought you the printouts showing the 2 parcel entries 3 days before the auction, what did you say to him?" Drum said, "I reviewed the information he provided and determined that the current digital record was the operative document for the transaction." Winifred said, "After Mrs. Hadley visited the bank, you sent an email to your legal department asking them to review the full documentation chain for the auction file. What did that review find?" Drum said, "The review confirmed the documentation was in order." Winifred said, "Mr. Drum, your legal department's review compared the digital record to the original paper record and found a 1-character discrepancy in the parcel number. Are you saying that review found the documentation was in order?" Ingram Galt said, "Objection, assumes facts not in evidence." Judge Hartwell said, "Mr. Drum, you may answer the question as it relates to what you personally were told." Drum was quiet for 4 seconds. In a room that quiet, 4 seconds is a long time. He said, "The review identified a potential discrepancy in the parcel numbering." Winifred said, "And the auction proceeded the following morning." It was not a question. She said it and let it stand in the room and sat down. Laverne was looking at Montgomery Drum. She had been looking at him since he sat down, not with anger, not with the bright heat of triumph, but with the steady, focused attention of someone who has waited a long time for a simple truth to be said out loud in a room where it could not be taken back. When he said those words, "the review identified a potential discrepancy," she did not change expression. She had known it was true since the morning she stood at the bank counter. Hearing it said under oath in a courtroom did not give her satisfaction so much as it gave her rest. The bone-deep exhaustion of a woman who has been holding something up for weeks and has finally been allowed to set it down. Judge Hartwell called a recess. When the court reconvened the following morning, Winifred submitted Absalom Farr's recorded testimony along with both copies of the 1961 survey map as exhibits. Judge Hartwell watched the recording in its entirety. The courtroom watched with her. Absalom Farr's voice came through the speakers at a steady pace, unhurried, the voice of a man who had measured things for 60 years and trusted the measurements. When he described walking the northeast corner of the Hadley property with a young man named Denton, who did not say much but watched everything, 2 people in the gallery looked down at their hands. The ruling came 4 days later, delivered in a written order that ran to 11 pages. The court found that parcel 003254 had been sold without valid authority. The court found that Harlan County Savings Bank had possessed information prior to the auction indicating a potential error in the parcel identification and had proceeded without conducting adequate verification. The court found that access to the public record had been improperly impeded through an arrangement between the bank's director and a county official. The sale was void. Ownership of the property was restored to Laverne May Hadley. The bank was ordered to fund full restoration of all structures demolished and to pay compensatory damages to be determined at a subsequent hearing. Montgomery Drum was terminated by the bank's board of directors on the day the ruling was issued. Lysander Crane had already resigned. Both men were referred to the county prosecutor's office for review of potential criminal charges relating to obstruction of a public records process. Winifred called Laverne from Nashville the evening the ruling came through. She said, "It is done." Laverne said, "Thank you." There was a pause, and then Winifred said, "Denton kept good records." Laverne said, "Yes, he did." That was the whole conversation. The reconstruction took most of the winter. Hawthorne Webb showed up at Laverne's door on a Saturday morning 2 weeks after the ruling, wearing work clothes and not a business suit. He stood on the porch with his hands in his jacket pockets and said, "Mrs. Hadley, I was the man who ran that demolition crew. I have my contractor's license, and I do restoration work on the side. I would like to rebuild what we tore down. I am not asking to do it for free. I know you would not want that. But I would like to be the one to do it, if you will hire me." Laverne looked at him for a moment. She thought about the morning he had walked toward her with the transfer papers and the way he had looked at the boundary description in them, and the way his eyes had shifted when she said the creek did not run straight. She said, "I will pay the going rate, not a dollar less." He said, "Yes, ma'am." She said, "Start Monday." He started Monday. Hollis Slade received a certified letter from the bank's HR department 12 days after the ruling informing him that his position had been eliminated as part of an organizational restructuring. He had expected it. He had already had 2 conversations with Winifred Voss about joining her office as a paralegal while he pursued his law degree, which he had been thinking about for 2 years but had not started. He accepted her offer the same day he received the termination letter. Kennard Pickett came over most mornings while the construction was underway, not to supervise, but because he was retired and the house was close, and he liked to have somewhere to be in the mornings. He and Hawthorne Webb developed an understanding early on the kind that forms between older men and younger ones, when the younger one is doing the work correctly and knows it, and the older one can see it. They did not talk much. They drank coffee from a thermos Kennard brought and looked at the progress and went back to their respective tasks. By February, the cattle shed was standing again. Not identical to Denton's original because Hawthorne had needed to use different lumber, but built to the same dimensions from the sketch Laverne had found in one of Denton's envelopes, the one from 1968 where he had drawn the shed in pencil from multiple angles because he was planning to rebuild after a rough winter. The new shed was tighter than the old one. Hawthorne said so himself. Laverne said Denton would have had opinions about that, and Hawthorne said probably so. The apple trees were the last thing. She had ordered the saplings from a nursery in Barberville in January, the same wine sap variety Denton had planted, the same rootstock if she could get it, and she had kept them in the keeping room through the cold weeks with the window cracked so they would not go soft. She had looked up everything she could find about transplanting dormant apple saplings in Tennessee and had written the key points in a spiral notebook in her careful handwriting the same way Denton would have done. She planted them on a Saturday in late February when the ground had thawed enough to work. Not warm, but workable. She dug the holes herself, 12 of them in the same row as before, in the same position she knew from 40 years of walking past them. Kennard offered to dig, and she told him to sit down, which he did on the overturned bucket he had brought for the purpose, and he watched her work without saying anything unhelpful. When she got to the 7th hole, the one that would hold the tree in approximately the position where Denton's first planting had stood, she stopped digging for a moment. She stood in the hole with the spade handle in both hands and looked at the ground she was standing in. This ground had been in her family for 63 years. It had been surveyed by a 26-year-old man who kept his copy. It had been measured by a man who did not say much but watched everything. It had been documented in pine boxes year by year for half a century by a man who believed that the truth written down carefully enough would outlast the people trying to ignore it. She went back to digging. When all 12 holes were dug, she went to the keeping room and brought the saplings out one at a time and set each one in its hole and worked the soil back around the roots with her hands pressing it firm, making sure there was no air pocket at the base. Kennard handed her the water bucket when she needed it without being asked. When the last tree was in the ground, she stood up and brushed the dirt from her knees and looked at the row. 12 bare sticks in February earth. They would not look like much until spring, and they would not bear fruit for years, and some of them would not survive their first summer. That was how apple trees worked, and there was no shortcut for it. Kennard came and stood beside her. He looked at the row of saplings and then out across the repaired fence to the field beyond, where the new cattle shed sat solid in the gray winter light. He said Denton would be satisfied. Laverne looked at the trees for a moment. Then she said, "He would tell me to go water them instead of standing here talking." Kennard smiled. She picked up the water bucket and went back to work. At the entrance to the farm on the fence post at the right side of the gate, there was a small wooden sign. Denton had made it himself in the 2nd year they lived on the property, cutting the letters into the wood with a chisel and painting them black. The paint had faded over 60 years to a soft gray that made the letters look like they had grown into the wood rather than been put there by a hand. The sign read Hadley Farm, and below that the parcel number 003254 in Denton's careful numerals. The sign had survived. The machines had not reached this part of the fence. It had been there through the auction, and the demolition, and the court hearings, and the long winter of rebuilding, holding the gatepost the same way it had held it for 6 decades, saying the same thing it had always said. Laverne looked at it on her way back from the trees. She stopped and touched the letters with her fingers, the raised edges of the chisel cuts that Denton had made by lamplight one winter evening, while she read in the next room. She remembered hearing the sound of the mallet and asking what he was doing, and him saying, "Just marking what is ours." She let her hand rest on the sign for a moment, then she picked up the water bucket and walked back into the farm.
When I was young, I chased the horizon. Certain peace was waiting there. I thought the storms were wrong turns taken, and every burden was unfair. So I spent years fighting the mountains, cursing every winding road, never seeing that the struggle was the thing that made me grow. The eagle learns within the wind, the oak grows strong beneath the snow, and every soul that's worth becoming must walk where harder paths may go. The road was never meant to be easy, the storm was never meant to pass. The waves were not there to stop me, they were there to teach me how to last. Every trial is part of the journey, every scar becomes a guide. The mountain is not in my way, the mountain is the reason for the climb. I've known loss that left me broken, I've known fear that stole my breath, I've known nights so cold and endless I could barely take one step. Yet every wound became a teacher, every failure left a mark, and every valley that I walked through placed another star within the dark. The river doesn't fight the canyon, it learns to carve its way ahead. What seems a wall to those who fear it becomes a path for those who tread. The road was never meant to be easy, the storm was never meant to pass. The waves were not there to stop me, they were there to teach me how to last. Every trial is part of the journey, every scar becomes a guide. The mountain is not in my way, the mountain is the reason for the climb. For the climb. One day I stopped asking, why me? And started asking, what can I learn? The moment I embraced the fire lost its power to burn. For every challenge holds a gift, though hidden from the eye. The obstacle and destination were never separate all this time. The road was never meant to be easy, the storm was never meant to end. The battles were not sent to break me, they were sent to shape the man I am. Every trial is part of the journey, every loss becomes a light. The mountain is not in my way, the mountain is the reason I can rise. The journey to